And one of the first things I learned in Excel was how to handle what's called a pivot table. Now, I'm going to give you the definition of a pivot table. It's probably going to be lost on you until I get into the weeds with this, but a pivot table is a spreadsheet tool that quickly organizes and summarizes data. It allows you to pivot your data around a variety of data points and thus provides you with information that would be difficult to assemble manually. What I basically said was a bunch of gibberish. So I'm going to show you what all of that means. And I'm going to use an example. This is a membership list of about, I think, 800 some odd people. And if I want to find out information about those businesses, I'm going to use a spreadsheet. And the way I would ask you to look at this is, in our spreadsheet, we have a list of zip codes. These are all the addresses of the businesses. If I asked any of you to tell me how many of these businesses were in each zip code, those of you who are not familiar with pivot tables would do something like this. Oops, misspelled zip code. Not a DIO code, it's a zip code, so I'll change that. I'm kind of a stickler for details like that. One option would be to sort the table. And I'm going to sort smallest to largest. I'm going to expand the selection. And then count, okay, we have two businesses in the 85002 zip code. We have several more in the 85003 zip code. And that would be one way to do it, but it would be very time consuming. And because you'd have to go through every one of these zip codes, and you also have the problems with bad data, such as a zip code that's 1803. Another option would be to filter. So I could say, let's filter the list of zip codes. And I'm going to say, okay, show me only the zip codes in 1803. And it would only give me one. I'd say, okay, I have one in 1803, and then I could go through the whole list and deselect that and maybe select my zip code, which is 85260. So you'll notice I'm scrolling down, I'm trying to find the zip code. And that would tell me I've got 131 businesses in the 85260 zip code. Again, it works, it's functional, but it's slow and it's painful. So this is where the pivot table comes in. Let's just clear those filters. Okay. What a pivot table does is it allows me to come up with all of those results with just a few mouse clicks. The first step in these mouse clicks is to select the data you want to incorporate into your pivot table. And as we go through this, I'm going to point out things that can create problems when you're creating a pivot table. One thing you want to make sure is that all of your columns have headers. If the columns do not have headers, your pivot table will not work. So I'm going to select all of the data in the pivot table, in the main member list table. I'm going to do that by clicking Control and A. That selects all of the data. And then I'm going to say, and this is where we're going to move into the pivot table, I'm going to say Insert. And in Excel, you have a pivot table button. If you're using Google Sheets, it's a little different, but virtually everything that I'm going to show you in Excel applies in Google Sheets. So if you're a fan of Google, you're not out of luck. I'm going to say Pivot Table. And then it's going to ask me, what do I want to incorporate, what data do I want to be able to manipulate in the pivot table? And you'll notice it's already listed all of the data that I selected by hitting Control A. And then it's saying, where do you want to put the pivot table? Experienced Excel users will tell you that there's almost never a time when you're going to drop a pivot table into the worksheet you're working on. It's messy, it's ugly, and it won't work well. You'll end up doing it the right way the first time you try to do it into an existing worksheet. What you're going to do is you're going to insert it into a new worksheet. And I'm going to click OK. And you'll notice it's created a new sheet within the spreadsheet. And it's named it Sheet 1. And again, I'm kind of a stickler for neatness. So I'm going to rename this, and we're going to call this Pivot Table. By the way, for those of you who are not completely familiar with Excel, I fairly regularly do seminars on an introduction to Excel. So if some of the stuff I'm doing you're not sure how to do, you can either ask me now or attend one of my other seminars. So what do we have on the pivot table screen? This box here is actually, you can think of it as a single cell, but for our purposes, this is where the magic is going to take place in the pivot table. And this is where we select our data. These are all of the fields, the pivot table fields. You'll notice each one of these fields has the same name as the column headers in the membership list. And I can select any of these fields, and we're going to select zip code to start. And you'll notice it did something funny. Excel saw the column of zip codes and noticed that they're all numbers. So it made the assumption that the first thing you do with numbers is add them all up. So the total of all of those numbers is something like 72,461,336. Utterly useless information, but that's what Excel is going to assume. We don't want a sum of the values. We want to use the zip code as an identifier. And then what we want to do is figure out how many of our companies are in each zip code. And this is where the magic happens. You'll notice it dropped company names into the rows rather than values because it didn't see a number there. It saw a name, it saw a text field. But I'm going to move that here. And now it's going to count how many companies are in each zip code. And when we were doing this before, and I said earlier when I said there were 2 companies in the 85002 zip code and 4 in the 85003 zip code, as we scroll down, we can see there are 130 in the 85260 zip code. We can see there are 127 in the 85251 zip code. And if I'm right, and we notice that and this is excellent for error catching. This is something I use frequently when I'm looking at data and I want to find problems in the data. 2 of my addresses don't have a zip code. 2 of the companies didn't have a zip code. So I know I'm going to go back if I want to find those companies. I'm going to say, okay, where are the companies without a zip code and why don't they have a zip code? And we can see right here, these 2 companies do not have a zip code. And that could create problems if you're using this as a mailing list. You're going to need a zip code. And in fact, in this one, we don't even have an address. So that's just one fairly easy use of a pivot table, is the ability to quickly, you'll notice how it took me, 3 mouse clicks to get a precise count of how many companies are in each zip code. Now, the neat thing is, and this is where pivoting comes, let's say I don't care about the zip code, so I'm going to get rid of that. I'm just going to drag it off. But I do care about the city they're located in. And this would obviously be more important if I wasn't just looking at a Scottsdale list. But you can see that we have, of my members, 129 of their addresses are actually in Phoenix, in the city of Phoenix, and so on. So what I've done is I'm pivoting. This is where the term pivot comes from. I'm pivoting the summary around the field that I'm interested in looking at. So again, we'll go back to zip code. And again, you'll notice because zip code's a number, it automatically threw it into values. So I'm going to throw it in there. So what we've done now is we said, okay, we can look at addresses. Well, that's handy. It's good to know that. But frequently, you want to look at other types of information. The businesses are, if you go back to the original spreadsheet, there are several different categories of membership. There's a children's membership. There is a nonprofit membership. And again, if I wanted to figure out how many of my members had a given type of membership, I'd have to, either sort or filter these. You'll notice with a pivot table, it becomes as easy as getting rid of the zip code. You can either drag and throw it away, or you can deselect it up here. I'm going to throw membership type in here. Now I know that I have 92 members with an Advantage, 257 with a Basic. We have 52 child members, 348 with Classic, nonprofit, and you can see how that becomes a very useful little tool. Well, let's say I wanted to figure out how much money is being generated by a given membership type. I'm going to add a column, and you'll notice now that it has summed up, and we'll just make this easier to read. I now know that of the membership, 110,000 is generated by the Advantage membership, The Classic is obviously the big winner. But oddly enough, even though it's a smaller number of members, an enormous piece of the money comes from the Partnership Council. And I also obviously get a subtotal here of how much money was generated in total. So basically what we're doing here is we're looking at now a count and a total. And you'll notice this field is a count field because you obviously can't add up the names of businesses, but you can count how many businesses are in here. And you can sum, because the dues is a number, you can sum that, you can do a mathematical calculation. There are lots of other things you can do with that number. You can change the nature of that value by going to the value field settings, and I can say I want to count instead of a sum. Now these will match precisely those numbers. I can, whoops, I didn't want to do that, let's put that back. And again, for this particular venture, these are not necessarily the most important things you can do, but you can come up with an average. We know that every Advantage dues amount is $1,200, so it's just giving us the actual amount of each individual level of dues, but you can see how these numbers can be manipulated to figure out a variety of things about the information you're looking at. Let's say I want to figure out how many people have paid their dues. Anywhere I see a blank, because you'll notice in the membership list, the dues is that if their dues is paid, they get an X in their column. Anywhere I see a blank, I know there's one member who didn't pay their dues for the Advantage level. There's 7 in the basic level. There's 2 child members. We got to go after them. There are 8 Classic members. And obviously, I can drill down to this. I can drill into all of these fields easily. But the point is, I can very quickly figure out where my missing dues is. Let's say I only want to look at a certain type of member. And let's put the company here. And I want to know the individual members in a given membership type. One way to do that is I can collapse these. You'll notice what I did was I dragged another data point that I want to pivot around. Let's get rid of that. Oh, we don't need that. So in this way, I can see each membership type, and I can get a count on how many of the members are in that type. And I can do that. You can put data points in both sides in both values and the row identifiers. So here, now I have a count, I have 92 in Advantage, and I can look then at each of the individual members and I can drill down into the members. So if I want to find members of a certain type, it becomes very easy to do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to figure out how many have paid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the paid and then I'm going to take the dues. And now I know that $631,000 has been paid and $11,950 is still unpaid. And what I'm trying to get to with you guys is I want to take you away from attempting to manipulate this all using this big data screen. And instead, you're going to be manipulating it through using the pivot table. I want to show you one last thing on this part of it. Let's get rid of this. I'm going to say the state. And then we're going to say, let's say the name, company name. And let's say I wanted to get rid of all of the businesses that are not in Arizona. Again, I can collapse all of the other states. And you'll see, by the way, again, here's another example of being able to check erroneous data. Excel expects that these fields are identical. So you'll notice AZ is capitalized here and AZ is not capitalized here. It treats those as 2 separate states. So in what I would do ordinarily is I'd go into each of these and correct that data and clean up the data on these 4 businesses to make sure that the AZ is capitalized. Sometimes you'll see that, and this is frequently a problem when you're using mailing lists, you'll see state names spelled out in some fields, and in other fields they're abbreviated. And usually when you're dealing, especially if you're sending out large mailings, you want to keep things as consistent as possible. So this, again, is a way of tracking down errors in your data. Okay, we've talked a little bit. Let's go back to a cleaner way of looking at this. And let's say we're going to look at membership type and company name. And we're going to talk about how to lay out a pivot table now. And let's do do's. When you're working with pivot tables, there are a variety of ways of looking at the actual table. This is what's called compact form. And when you're in the pivot table, if you go to whenever you're in a pivot table, there are 2 new pull-down menus that appear. Actually, these are ribbon menus. And if you go into design, you will see a button that says report layout. Right now, we're in the compact form. When I'm depending on the type of data, I have never seen a reason to ever work in the outline mode form, but I frequently will work in the tabular form. And I will shrink the column sizes down a little bit to make it neater. But I find that sometimes this is a less confusing way of looking at things, especially when you want to do some filtering. It becomes much easier to do the filtering when you're in the tabular mode, the full table mode, as opposed to the compact mode. So that's one of the things you want to learn how to do. Again, to get there, you go to design, and then report layout. You can also add some things. And you can add things like subtotals. We don't need them here, but you can add subtotals, grand totals. Again, as you're going through the data, you'll find reasons to use those. In this set, it doesn't make sense to use those. And you can see at the bottom the advantage. It gave me a subtotal of 110,000. Useful. There are easier, faster ways to get at that data using a pivot table. I'm just showing you that that's one of the abilities you have to do when you're working with your layout. Let's talk about things that will make a mess of your pivot table. This is the first thing that happens to people when they're working on a pivot table. They accidentally click outside the pivot table, and all of the stuff you're working on disappears. So all you have to do is remember, just click inside the pivot table, it comes right back. I can't tell you how many times I've taught people how to use pivot tables, and I get a phone call or they call me over to the desk and say, I can't figure out how to get my stuff back, my field selectors back in the pivot table, and it's literally as easy as a mouse click. Another thing that will mess up your pivot table, let's delete this entire pivot table, delete. I'm on my membership list, and I'm missing a column header. I'm going to select it. Again, Control A. I'm going to say insert a pivot table. I'm going to say OK, and I'm going to get an error. Why? Because data was selected, but there was no column header for the data that was selected. And as a result, the pivot table doesn't know what to do. So we put that back. Another thing, a blank column. I'm going to go select all. And first of all, you'll notice that happens. But let's select all this way. I go to insert pivot table. I say OK. And same problem. There's a blank column here. It doesn't know what to do. It will not work. I will tell you that the most common reason for that to happen is you're exporting data from a database. I don't know how often you guys get the opportunity to do that, but you export data from a database. And for whatever reason, the way the database exports the data, it leaves a blank column. People working on that spreadsheet might do something like this. The column's still there, it's just hidden. Now, when I hit Control A, and then bring it all the way across, let's just bring it all the way across, and I say insert pivot table, you're going to have the same problem. So what I usually do when I talk to people, when people call me and say they're having problems with a pivot table, and that's the problem, I typically tell them, first thing I want you to do is select the entire pivot table, right-click, and say unhide. That will identify that blank column for you. And again, the most frequent time that happens is when you have a table, a spreadsheet that was exported from a database, and the database left a blank column. There are times you'll receive data from other parties who have hidden empty columns. So first thing, frankly, as part of what I do, the first thing I do when I get data, especially from another party, is I automatically select the table and just click unhide to find anything that's lurking in there that shouldn't be lurking in there. Another problem that you can have with pivot tables is fields that look like one thing but are really another. We're just going to call this test. If I type an apostrophe, and then the number 1001, you'll notice that in the field it looks like a number. There is a telltale, there's a little green, and I'm not sure how clearly you can see it on your screen. There's a little green arrow in the top left-hand corner that indicates that it's not really a number. But for all intents and purposes, you won't know that. And if I duplicate that, these all look like numbers. But now, when I go to do a pivot table, say OK, and I say, give me the state, and then give me the test, and I want to total those, it can't, because there's nothing to total. There's no number in there. It's actually a text field that I stuck in there. So and this again is a very frequent occurrence when you're getting data from a database. You don't know how that data was formatted, so you always need to make sure that you're actually dealing with a number. And again, you'll bang your head against the wall because you'll say, well, I've got this list column of numbers, why isn't it adding it up? Another time we frequently see it is with dollar signs. People will put a dollar sign in, but it's not really a number. Excel will see it as a number sometimes, but if the data was sent from the database as a text field, not a numeric field, the system doesn't know what to do with it and it can't add it. So that is one of the, again, these are headache points for you guys. When you're working with a pivot table, those are the types of problems you will see. So I've just covered a lot. Are there any questions? Because I'm going to go back and review some of this stuff. I'm going to go through it really slowly, but I wanted to give you a real good taste of what a pivot table does. Do any of you guys have any questions?
Yeah, Alan, just because that was very fast. You're very good at this.
Yes.
So just like slow motion from scratch, if I got this data, I want to do a pivot table of the ribbon up there. What header, what is that under? Like, where do we start?
Yep. I'm going to do this all very slowly. What I wanted to do is what I try to do in the first part of this is give you guys an overview so you see all the power of the pivot table. Now I'm going to go through really in the weeds, granular, step by step, whatever corporate term you want to use.
Yep.
So we've been given this list of addresses, and the boss says, tell me what you know about all of this, about all of these companies. And you say, okay, boss. Well, the first thing we're going to do is make sure our data is good. Before we do anything else, and again, step by step, I'm going to select the whole spreadsheet, and I'm going to right-click and say unhide, so that I can see all of the data is where it's supposed to be. The next thing I'm going to do is click Control A. This gives me, Control A will select all cells with data, as long as they're adjacent to each other. So top to bottom, side to side, as long as there's data in the column or the row, it will select all of them. And then I'm going to go to Insert on the ribbon, and I'm going to go to Pivot Table. And one of the things I like to remind people is how few clicks this really is. So I've got the data, I hit Control A, I clicked on the insert ribbon, and I clicked on pivot table. These are already pre-selected. You'll notice again, the data has been is based on a selection. And the new worksheet is the default, which is a good thing. They should just eliminate existing worksheet. And I'm going to say, okay. The system, the Excel will automatically open a new worksheet within the spreadsheet, which if we're me, we're going to rename and call it pivot table. And you might have several different pivot tables depending on the data you want to represent. You might have several different sheets with pivot tables. And now, again, we're looking at the pivot table fields. Again, each one of these is the column header in the member list worksheet. And the first thing we want to do is say, what information do we want? Well, the information I want, the thing I want to know about are zip codes. Again, Excel sees those zip codes as a number because they are numbers and automatically drops them into the values section. This is the summary section. Values, again, the word here should really be summary, not values. And this should be identifiers, not rows, but I can't, Microsoft doesn't listen to me. So I'm going to move the sum of the zip over to the rows. So this is the thing I want to know about. I want to know the characteristics of the zip code. And then what do I want to know about that zip code? Well, I first want to know how many companies are in each zip code. Now you'll notice it automatically assumed that this is a text field and it's not going to summarize it, but I disagree with them. I want that summarized. I want a number. I want the Excel to count how many companies are in each zip code. So I'm going to move that to the values. And you'll notice that Excel automatically assumes you want to count a text field. You're not going to add or subtract a text field, but you can count a text field. And this gives me the number of businesses in a given zip code. Let's say, what else do we want to know about? Let's say we want to know about the membership type. This automatically, Excel sees a text and it automatically assumes you want to use it for a row label. And let's say I want to know how much money is generated by that membership type. I'm going to click dues. Again, Excel automatically saw a number, so it automatically plugged that number into values, and it assumed that you wanted to know the sum of, or the total amount of dues paid. Again, this is just because I'm a little anal retentive. And it gave me the sum of the dues paid. And that's really all there is to it. I mean, I wish I could make this way more complicated, but it really is that simple to do this type of manipulation. Again, you can change the nature of the value you're looking at. The way you do that is you click on the down arrow at the end of the values, and it says value field settings. And let's say I don't know why I'd want to do this, but I want to change it to count. Well, I guess that's useful. Now I know how many businesses are in each level of membership. But let's leave that as sum, and let's just add a new one. I'm going to take membership type that appears right here, and I'm using this right now as a row label, but I also want Excel to count the membership types, the number of members in each membership type. So I'm going to drop it here again. Again, you can drop things more than one time. And we don't want this to be $1. We want this to be a count. So we're just going to change this to general. And now I know that there are 110, that in the Advantage level of membership, there are 92 members, and they've paid a sum total dues of $110,400. You can manipulate this any way you want. To get rid of a field, again, you can either deselect it, or you can drag it and throw it away. And then I say, I'd rather know by city, the sum of the dues, and then I want to know how many members. So this tells me that in Scottsdale, there are 611 members. In Phoenix, there are 129 members. And again, it does this. All I'm doing is saying, what data do I want to know about? I want to know about a city. And what do I want to know about that city? I want to know how much dues is coming out of that city. And I want to know how many members are in that city. So again, the rows section is what do you want to know about? And the values section is the description, the summary of the data about this data point. There are a lot of other things, by the way, you can do with this. I've done this with area codes. If you have a telephone, and I'm just going to show you real quickly. If you have a list of phone numbers, you can separate this column into separate columns where the area code is separate from the telephone number, from the local number, and that'll give you a count of how many, members are in a given area code. That can be useful if you're doing outbound calling for, say, a membership drive, or even if you're cold calling for new clients. You want to target specific area codes. You don't, maybe if you're a local business, you don't want to target area codes that are outside of your, your local calling area. So.
Well, okay, so actually kind of encountered this today when I was working on some reports for a client, and we get a lot of requests for, they want totals by state, or they want totals by this, for wages and things like that. So once you create the pivot table and you get the data into the pivot table, is there any way that you can copy that and just paste the values to a separate spreadsheet so they don't have to see all that data that's associated with the pivot table? Okay.
Okay, you get the gold star for the best question of the day.
Oh, good.
So let's do a real simple one. Membership type. That, by the way, that's a great question. I should have thought of that. I'm a little embarrassed now. I'm shame. I always make things pretty. So I got my membership types and my sum of dues. All I do is select this, right-click and copy, and let's go to a new sheet just to show you what it would look like. And let's say I want to make it pretty. Now watch what I'm pasting. I am not pasting the pivot table. I am pasting the data that's in the pivot table, the results of the pivot table.